Right, good morning, Year 10. I've just marked your mock exam papers, specifically Section B, which is the section in which you evaluated the performance we watched, which this year was the Oresteia. I'm going to talk generally about what I saw you do in the exam, and more importantly, how we're going to move forward. Now, the first thing you're going to get in the exam, obviously in that Section B, is the question. And when I'm talking about the exam in general to begin with, our recommendation is that you do the long answer questions first. That you start probably with Section B. In fact, I'll take the probably out. You're going to start with Section B. It's the longest answer question, so go straight for that one. And then work your way backwards through the DNA section. Okay, so you do the long answer questions first. So the few of you that didn't leave yourself enough time, having done the short answer questions and then rushed through Section B, not getting enough down in the time you allowed yourself, do the long answer questions first. Okay, without fail. Now the bit that you get to see in the exam is the question. So on the rest of this document here, which we've taken out from the secure section with the advice for how to mark it, you won't get that. You'll just get this bit. You'll just get analyse and evaluate. In this case, it was movement skills. It might just as easily be voice. A couple of you chose to answer it in terms of costume, which I'll be honest was not a good choice. We're going to talk about this in terms of this specific question, but generally speaking, the points need to be applied in different ways depending on whether you're doing voice or different skills that it's talking to you about. So, analyse and evaluate how movement skills were used in 2 key scenes to communicate meaning to the audience. Unpacking this question one step at a time. If I'm in the exam, the first thing I'll do is circle that. This seems really, really obvious, and I'm sorry if I'm teaching you to suck eggs. Some of you did get this right. But quite a few of you, even some of the more detailed answers, were spending too much time talking about how they said lines or what they were wearing. This is not a question about costume. It's not a question about voice. Those things might be relevant to mention in passing, but only if it informs our understanding of what you're talking about in terms of the movement, because that's what the question wants you to do. Okay, so stick to that. Don't give me half a paragraph on their use of pace in their voice or their tone in this question. If it's a voice question, great, talk about voice. Okay, 2 key scenes. Actually, most of you did tackle 2 key scenes. There were a couple of people who only did 1, and that's probably a time management problem. There were a couple of students who kind of spoke about 2 scenes, but the way you'd written it and your lack of paragraphing meant that it came across like you were talking about 1 scene. And if you're literally talking about, for example, the men of the city and then the entrance of Clytemnestra, and you run that section together in 1 enormous paragraph, it will sound like 1 scene. And no matter how good your answer is, if it's a band 5 or a band 4 answer, if you're only talking about 1 scene, then we're right here. It says in band 2, that's only between 4 and 6 marks. Some appropriate examples from 1 or both of the chosen scenes. You only do 1 scene, you're going to be straight down to band 2 without fail. Okay, so look out for that. So, movement skills, that's what you're talking about. 2 key scenes, make sure you cover them. Communicating meaning to the audience. Actually, you didn't do so badly on that one, but it is clear that that's what you're talking about. What each movement, what each bit of proxemics, what each facial expression was signifying to the audience about the character, their status, where they are in the story and other aspects. You then get this really handy bullet point list to remind you of things to put down. Now this first one, the style of the production, it's really vital that you put that in. And in some respects, it is just saying once in the opening paragraph the style of the production, which in the case of the Oresteia by Splendid Productions was epic theatre. Lots of you put down that it was a Greek tragedy, and yes, that's not incorrect, but it's not the style of the production. Okay, the style of the production was epic theatre, and that's what you need to make more explicit, because you run a risk of the examiner thinking you haven't mentioned it if you just say it's a Greek tragedy. We'll talk about linking more to do with that later on, but it mentions in every single band. Okay, even in the bottom band, it mentions, and here on the top one, reference to the style of the production. It's in every single band. You could do the most brilliant, perfect top band 15 out of 15 answer. If you don't mention the style of the production, you'll drop to the bottom of that band at best. Okay, so get that in there. And we've gone through this. We know it's epic theatre, so stick it in there. And in the same breath, while we're talking about epic theatre, the number of you talked about gestures and not gestus. I swear blind, we mentioned the word gestus about 10 times in every lesson leading up to this, and most of you didn't use the word gestus. One person used the word spas in relation to the comedy that was being used, and that was an appropriate term as well, linked to the style of the production. All right. Second bullet point, how movement skills were used to create character and communicate meaning. Pretty much repetition of what's up here as well. That doesn't need dwelling on too much, as long as you're addressing it in enough detail. One thing that was frequently missed out or tacked on at the end, your response to the performance as an audience member, the impact on you, how and why you found it engaging, how and why it informed your understanding of what was going on the stage, the fact that you were shocked, surprised, or amazed, any kind of adjectives that you can use to talk about the performance's impact on you. Stick that in. I was going to leave it till later, but I'll mention it now. What some of you did is you took this bullet point list and you had your introductory paragraph, and then you talked about your two scenes, and then at the end, in a final paragraph, you talked about your response to the performance as an audience member. This bullet point list is not an essay plan. You absolutely have to embed your response to the performance as an audience member into you talking about each skill within each scene. So if you're talking about Clytemnestra and Nuala's use of posture and her use of gestus to indicate her status and her attempt to unsex herself and be more masculine in a world of men, then you talk about your response as an audience member. And then if you mention something else, such as her use of space or the proxemics in relation to the girls that were playing the men of the city, then again talk about your audience response and the impact on you. Don't leave it to the end, because what you do when you do that is you talk in general terms about how you enjoyed it, and you're not referring to the actual movement skills that you should be evaluating, because that's what you're talking about in terms of the impact and your response to those. Okay, so don't leave them to the end and just talk in general terms. Okay, so I've covered how to structure it, and one last thing to mention is make sure, because most of you got this in quite well actually, there are a couple that didn't, make sure in your structure you start with your introductory paragraph. We saw the Oresteia presented by Splendid Productions on this day at Roding Valley High School. It was a piece of epic theatre. There's your style, chucked in right at the beginning. Put that introductory paragraph in. If you go straight in without it, talking about the entrance of Clytemnestra, there's a risk there, and the examiner does not know what you're talking about, and you've not referenced the style of the production. Okay. Couple of bugbears. Talking about posture, please don't use the phrase good posture or bad posture. It is a meaningless statement. It's a value judgment. You could talk about upright posture. You could talk about slouching. Those make more sense. You could talk about shoulders dropping down, or a head on a chest, or whatever. Just describe it in detail, but to say something is good posture or bad posture is just generally a bit vague and should be avoided. Pleased to say that no one used the word normal, when describing anything, which is good because avoid the word normal like the plague. Again, it's another meaningless statement. And while we're there, let's talk about detailed examples. What a lot of you did is you spoke in general terms, maybe about posture, maybe about being upright, but you weren't talking in detail about everything that the actors did. If you're talking about the gestus that Nuala used as Clytemnestra, moving her hands apart as if stretching a piece of elastic, which effectively signified the strength of her spine and the tension in her whole body. That would be a good way to describe it. Screwed up facial expressions, grotesque facial expressions, they would work. Talking about the pace of movement, talking about, no one talked about gait. Remember, gait is not something you walk through, it's how you walk. Okay, it's linked to posture, it's linked to stance, but gait is the steps people are taking, a wide gait, a narrow gait, walking in small steps. These are things you can talk about. So just be detailed and talk about as much as you can. Now, what you don't get in the exam, that we get when we mark it, or the examiner gets when he or she marks it, is this little description here. But we have gone through this, and the Give Me 5 sheets that we did asked you about all of these things in terms of movement and more. So the use of body language to communicate meaning, yes, that can definitely include posture. It can include body language being closed or body language being open. A couple of you referenced that, and that's a really good thing to reference. Closed or open to other actors on the stage, or closed or open to the audience. The use of facial expressions, again, be specific, and please don't ever use phrases like an angry facial expression. That again is a meaningless statement. I don't know what an angry facial expression is. If you say that an actor screwed up her face and used a lot of tension to signify the character's anger, then that makes more sense. You're talking about basic communication theory. This is what we saw, and this is what was signified by it. Talking about gestures, open hands, closed fists, the pace of those movements, the pace of movements and body language, the use of gestus. Please, if you're talking about epic theatre, and if in future years we're reviewing splendid productions, we will be also talking about epic theatre, because the splendid style is largely epic theatre. Then please use the word gestus. The examiner will understand what you're talking about. You don't need to explain what gestus is. You just use that term because it's linked back to the style of the piece. Movement does include use of proxemics. The characters, the actors, closeness or far awayness, not real words, to each other. The number of times we mentioned in class about the male characters stood behind, upstage of Clytemnestra, and what that signified and what they allowed them to do. Allowed them to take the mickey out of Clytemnestra with their grotesque facial expressions, hands held to their ears. Noah mentioned, by the way, that the hands held to the ears were held upside down in a way that contorted their bodies even more and added yet more tension to their body language. Why didn't you mention that? How the style of the production influenced the kind of physical skills used. Now, some of you alluded to this, but didn't really land on the point as well as you should have done. Use the word gestus, and then talk about how the gesture with the attitude signified how the character, in an almost symbolic way, felt about the other character, how it also alluded to them not being real, fully realised psychological characters. These aren't naturalistic characters, these are character types. Okay, because Brecht and epic theatre deals in character types. It alludes towards society in general and what is problematic in society, which in the case of the Oresteia and the men with their hands held high in a gestus as if to signify holding a brandy glass up in the air, signified their status and was part of the use of epic theatre to criticise and show what is wrong with a male-dominated society, a point that would have been relevant in ancient Greece and is relevant in modern society as well. And then you can go on to talk about the impact on you as an audience member and how you feel about what they're saying about modern society as well as ancient Greek society. And there's a reason why Splendid did this show in this way. It's not a piece of theatre in aspic. It's not a museum piece of theatre that's going to show you what Greek theatre is back in the day. Isn't this nice, like something in a box in a museum? It's a comment on contemporary society. Kerry Frampton and Splendid Production, by doing the Oresteia in this way, are having a rant about what it is to be a woman in modern society. Okay, there's a purpose to their work. Response as an audience member, which again needs to be embedded, not stuck at the end. Your individual response to the movement. So for each example that you cover, what did you get from that? How did you understand it? What was the impact on you? May include a preference for one scene. You are allowed to make a value judgment. We've said that it's good to go into the exam and be positive, that an examiner doesn't want to read you writing about how rubbish something is. Because there's the risk that you come across as sounding ignorant, like, don't get it, it's rubbish. So don't be that student. But you can say that this scene was even stronger because this scene had the strongest impact on me because. And then your response as an audience member is really, really clear because you're talking about how extra fab you thought one particular bit or idea or approach or moment or character was because of how they communicated an idea to you through their movement. Answers should explain the context of the scenes and how movement is presented and developed. Answers should focus on significant moments within the chosen scenes. So the context of the scenes, where we are in the story. Don't give me loads of narrative, but you can. At this point in the story, Clytemnestra is addressing her people about the arrival or return of her husband. That's enough. We know where we are in the scene that way, and then you can talk about how the actor is moving in a way to fit those, to use a Stanislavskian term, to fit those given circumstances, to fit that moment. Okay, so my top tips are, in summary: 1, read the blooming question. Movement skills. If that's what the question asks you, next year's exam paper might be a different choice. Okay, if it says 2 key scenes, do 2 key scenes. Your response to the performance as an audience member should be embedded in the piece. Don't leave it to the end just because it's the 3rd bullet point. This is not a essay plan. Make sure you are detailed. Excellent perceptive analysis and evaluation of the use of movement to communicate meaning to the audience. Make sure that your examples are detailed and specific. Avoid talking in vague, generalized terms. Make sure you're talking about that specific scene. Just don't talk about the whole piece, for heaven's sake. 2 key scenes. Make sure you've referenced the style of the production. Put it in your opening paragraph and then reference it later on. And if it's relevant, because if it's epic theatre, do use terms like breaking the fourth wall, gestus, spas. You put those terms in. There are plenty more. The fact that the use of strange making, okay, or if you're feeling brave, Befremdungseffekt, but strange making will do. Don't use alienation. We don't like that word here. Perceptive analysis and evaluation of your own response to the movement. So I enjoyed it because, and then go into detail. This was effective because this helped me understand that. It was clear that the audience were really engaged by this moment. The use of spas at this moment was particularly funny. Her characterization in this over-the-top, stylized and grotesque way was found to be really amusing by the audience. Her open gestures and slowness of pace allowed the audience to engage with her and be drawn to her character. These would all be appropriate things to say. Okay, and please, no good or bad postures. That'll do for now. Rant over. Goodbye.